Hi folks, Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network. Welcome back to week 2 of Sunday sessions with Rob Flux. Once again, sitting on my back deck, beer in hand, and going to be talking to the world about all things property and property development. Each week we've got a new theme. So the theme for this week is the different reasons that people purchase property. Hi Kim, hi Les, I can see that you've just joined. Welcome aboard. This week we're going to be talking about the different, and Vanessa, how are you? I won't say hello to everybody as we come online. That could get quite tedious, but I can see a number of people jumping on straight away. So this week's theme is going to be talking about why people actually get into the property development, into the property process, or why they purchase property at all. I'm going to apologise in advance. You'll see a little bit of shaking going on with the camera. I'm actually outside. You can see the leaves back here blowing really, really hard. So the camera is actually shaking around as well. So my humble apologies from that perspective. I promise it's not that I've got the DTs, although one or two of these, and who knows where that's going to go. So why purchase property? Now, I've actually put a poll up. Hopefully everyone can actually get to that poll and respond to that poll. To be honest, it's the first time I've used Facebook Live with the polls, so I'm not 100% sure that I've actually done that correctly, but all going to plan, you should have a question there that you can actually respond to. So, oh wow, there's quite a few jumping on at the moment. So what are the reasons for purchasing property? There are primarily 4 reasons. 3 of them are investment related in order to actually get some sort of return for your funds. And the other one is more, I guess, lifestyle related. So if I just rattle them off in sequence, and then I can go back and flesh out what each of those actually mean. So hi Russell, hi Edward, how are you? Clayton, Brad, I can see a number of you jumping on. So first and foremost is investments. So long-term buy and hold, typically for a capital gain. Now, a lot of the times when you're actually seeing news articles and the industry actually talking, they're actually talking about that long-term investment approach. And so the market indicators that sit around those sorts of things are completely different from some of the other reasons that you might actually go into a property cycle. So the next one would be cash flow. So you're wanting positively geared properties to actually generate some cash as you go. The third reason would be to add some value in some way, shape or form through some of your own sweat equity and actually flip that. So property development, I guess, falls into that category. And the fourth reason to actually purchase a property is some sort of lifestyle. Now, I've also had a 5th one thrown out to me this week, and that is, and it wasn't one that was on my radar, but I guess to give back to the community in some way, shape or form. So I guess that technically does sit there. Jeff saying I can't see the poll questions, but all going. Okay, no worries. Well, I don't know how to get those polls on, but I'll see if I can work that out while I'm talking to you, Jeff. So clearly that's a technical issue on my behalf with regards to why that's not going live. From a investment property perspective, when you're looking at the long-term gains, as I said, capital growth is one of those things where you're reliant on the market doing the heavy lifting for you. So when you're relying on the market, you don't have a lot of control. You can do a lot of effort initially to make sure that you're going into an area that has the highest probability of capital growth. So you'd be looking for things like jobs in the area, infrastructure in the area, I guess industries actually moving in. So some of the big, you know, if you see McDonald's and Bunnings and Coles and that sort of thing going into an area, it's fairly likely that the area is actually growing, so it has a long-term capital growth perspective. But the problem with that is you're actually subject to the market and the market moving up and down where you're not actually in control. And so if you have that long-term view and you can get out in 10 plus years time, then the likelihood is that that return will actually come back to you. The challenge is because the market cycles go up and down, if you need to get out at any point in the cycle, you may be getting out during a lull. So hypothetically, or by way of example, the Sydney and Melbourne market at the moment are a little bit of a slump as to where they were 2 years ago. But if you got in 10 years ago, they're, I guess, comparatively quite high. So if you got in 10 years ago and got out at the top of the cycle, you did fantastically well. But if you got in 2 months ago and then you're trying to get out, sorry, not 2 months ago, 2 years ago, and now you're trying to get out now, you're probably going to take a little bit of a hit on it. So thanks, Luke. 22 viewers. Chicks love it. I don't know how many chicks are on here, mate. I can see Sasha on here. I can see, but most of the rest of them are dudes. So I'm not sure about the chicks. But hello, Sasha, either way. From a cash flow perspective, I guess there's a number of things that you can do. Cash flow, positive cash flow, is one that is an investment strategy in and of itself. Too many times when we go into those long-term capital growth perspectives, we're tempted by the negative gearing aspects of that. And so it's a completely different flip when you're looking for positive cash flow. Now, if we look at the negative gearing side of things, that actually creates a little bit of a roadblock for you, or a glass ceiling. So every single property that you purchase then creates, I guess, a negative cash flow impact, and your bank then deems that you don't. Yeah, hello, Sasha. Come on, chicks. Yes. So every time you buy another property, the bank deems that your income is lower and lower. So that then impacts your ability to borrow the next property and impacts the next property. Now, over time, as capital grows, you can actually pull some of that equity out and re-borrow. Hopefully your rental returns go up in the meantime. But I did 20 years of buy and hold, and I found that negative cash flow situation was restricting me significantly from actually moving ahead in the early days. Oh, sorry, my wife. Sorry, hello, that's one other chick. So hello, Cecilia. My apologies. But yeah, 2 chicks. So yeah, and rising, yay. From a positive cash flow perspective, there's a number of things that you can actually do. I've got a number of rent per room student accommodation properties, but there are a number of other different strategies that you can do there. The challenge there is to try and create a situation where the return outweighs the income, which is very difficult to do if you're not manufacturing the profit in the process to start with. So if you're trying to buy an existing property with that return, makes it very hard to achieve. What we do though is if we use the third strategy, which is forcing value through the property development process, we can actually manufacture those properties that are in a positive cash flow situation a lot easier. We're creating those at a wholesale rate rather than a retail rate. And when you're creating them at a wholesale rate, you've effectively built in an equity buffer right up front. And you have the opportunities for whether it be an Airbnb, rent per room situation, a dual income, a dual occupancy, all those sorts of things. They're the different ways to actually generate that. Now, I guess you get the double whammy if you get the ability to, I've been corrected, 3 women. So hello, Shelley, as well. Oh, and Alex, 4. I'm going to stop counting now. I think we've got the point. I've lost track there, so sorry, guys. I guess from the utopian goal, though, is if we try and combine the 3 strategies into, I guess, one effective outcome. So if you're able to add value through the property development process and then keep the profits and not actually sell them, by keeping the profits, you're not technically cashing in. And if you're not cashing in, you only get taxed at the point where you actually go to sell. So it's a deferred tax mechanism. So effectively, you get to keep all of the profit that you manufacture. You can have that long-term buy and hold approach. And if you manufacture something that is positive cash flow, then you've effectively tapped into all 3 of those income streams. So, for example, I've got some properties that I've actually generated through my property development process that are rent per room student accom as long-term buy and hold now, that I never sold as one of my the outcomes of one of my deals. So effectively, I manufactured the capital, was able to withdraw the cash that I invested into that process, able to hold the project and I guess the retained assets at the end of that as a positive cash flow moving forward. So I guess a little bit of a win in all categories. And then the fourth one, the fourth category then is doing something for lifestyle, and the lifestyle then becomes very emotive. So the financial side of things tend to go out of the window, and we're more caring about, is it near somewhere that we'd like to live? Is it near the schools that we want our children to go to? Is it the holiday home that we're having, wanting to have, those sorts of things. Shelley says, love the thought of being able to keep all of the profit by saving tax. That, I have to say that when you get to the point, Shelley, where you can actually keep some of your profits rather than having to flip, that's where you start to accelerate really, really well. Now, I'll give that as an example. If you hypothetically made $100,000 profit in one of your deals, then the likelihood is that you're going to be paying GST, so you might be giving away 10% of that in GST, depending upon whether or not you've got the margin scheme, but let's not get overly complicated here. Then, depending upon the company structure that you've actually got in place, you may be forced to then pay 28.5 cents on the dollar company tax in order to, I guess, for the profits of that. So you've really got 37.5 or 38 cents in the dollar that's actually gone out the window of that 100K. And then if you then distribute that down to a person, then it depends on the individual person's income stream as to how much profit actually makes it through to the keeper. Now, if you manage to keep the property instead, then you get to keep 100 cents in the dollar, and only at some point in the future, when you sell the property, will that tax actually be due. Now, the thing there is, if you never ever sell, well, then technically your tax deferral has gone, I guess, a very long way. So it's important to say this isn't tax avoidance. It is, I guess, tax deferral. And from that perspective, if you avoid tax, or you're looking to avoid tax, that is not legal. But if you defer tax, that is actually legal. So with that said, I can see lots of people making lots of comments, but I guess looking for questions from the crowd. Luke says he does not do emotions. Mate, I've seen you emotional. That I don't believe that for a moment. So now just going through some of the comments to see what other people have said. So I can see Carol online, Shelley online, Luke online. Any questions from the crowd, folks? Especially if we can keep it in and around this theme would be ideal. Hey, Steve, how are you, mate? I can't see anything coming through, so do you want me to keep prattling on? Hey, Steve is, I don't know if that's a laugh or a cry, Steve, but I'll take that as a laugh. Now, you guys can't see this, but right there on the other side of this camera, I've got a cat who's looking at me through the window and scratching at the window. So it's very good to laugh at. Steve, valuations. That's a statement, not a question. What would you like me to say about valuations? How do we get around really low vals? The challenge there, Steve, is it's actually depending upon who is actually doing the val for you. If it's a bank valuer, there's actually a number of different ways that they can do the valuation and the purpose for that valuation. There's always a range that valuers can actually go within. So let's just say it's a variation of that much. Now, where they land in the range depends on the purpose of what you're doing. So if you're refinancing your own home, then generally they know that you're not trying to sell, so they know that they're not likely to get sued if you sell the property for under the market, because the valuation's only lasting for 3 months, and because you're not putting on the market, they know that their valuation's going to be safe. So generally they'd be at the higher end of the scale. If you're looking to do something like a capital gains assessment, you bought a property a while ago and you need to assess what the capital gain was between one period and another period, they might be prepared to value it at the high end of the range under one scenario and the low end of the range at the other. So really, if you're the one engaging the valuer, then you're the one who gets to control which end of the range they go to based on what are your requirements for the process. The challenge is that when the banks do it, the bank is the one giving the instruction to the valuer. So the bank is saying, well, we need to make sure that we can get what can we get for it at a fire sale? And so that's the instruction that the valuer is going for. So he's always going to be at the bottom of the range. What I do to try and avoid that is I try to get a private valuer. So I pay a separate fee, get the private valuer to actually value where in the range I think is fair and appropriate for the purpose that we're actually going to, and I then provide that to the bank's valuer and say, well, here's an independent valuation. Why would yours be somewhat different if those sales are actually correct? So question from Shelley. So the theme is, what are the reasons to purchase property? So question from Adam, advice on deals to target where you're just starting out in the game with little cash equity to get going. So I'm going to say, Adam, that the strategy has little to, well, I won't say little to do with the equity. So what the strategy is and how you fund the strategy can be unrelated. Now you need, I guess there's three problems that you need to solve from a funding the deal. So one is equity in order to fund the deposit. One is serviceability in order to manage the debt. And the third one is liquidity in order to run the deal. Now, how you do that can actually, how you actually solve those three problems might actually be dealt with from a terms in an acquisition perspective. So if you can get deferred terms, then you don't need the deposit initially and you don't need the funding initially. And depending upon how long that deferral is, you may be able to pay for it at the tail end. So then all you really need to look for is the liquidity of the deal. So there's a few different variations in that. But what I would say with regards to where to target, sorry about the wind bumping the camera there. What I would say with regards to areas to target, it really comes down to what is your investment strategy. So if you know that you're going to do subdivisions, then where you go looking for subdivisions is going to be completely different to where you go looking for townhouses. So and a term that I really, really hate is hotspots, right? So a hotspot is going to be very specific to the development strategy that you're going to execute. So a great spot for townhouses is going to be nothing like a great spot for subdivisions, which is going to be nothing like a great spot for granny flats. So your own individual strategy will have its own hotspots. So my advice is get your strategy right, and then based on your strategy, then work out where you want to actually start to target, Adam. So if you go the other way around, what you'll find is you're analysing suburbs with a very low likelihood of success. So Steve Christo, have a 33-lot land subdivision near Hobart that was bought for 1.7 and approved with a 1.4 val, but vendor left 400K equity in the deal. Deal has dragged on 6 months and they wanted another val, and the kick in the guts came in last week at 940. Ouch, mate. No, now the funder is asking for another $500,000 in equity. It's a little bit difficult after the fact, Steve, but that's whenever I'm doing something like that, I would always be getting the private valuer first. And if you need to shop around for multiple private valuers, you know, it might cost you $1,000 for each one, but then you get the valuation that you want, and then you hand that to the bank's valuer. Get that to guide the process. The challenge there is whether or not the market is going in your direction or not, to see whether or not they can actually substantiate that. Shelley, if purchasing a property to subdivide, do you need to consider the bank having to split the loan into two once the block is subdivided? That's a very, very good question, Shelley. So the reality is that at the end of the process, well, I'm going to start at the start of the process, depending upon how you've actually acquired the deal. Typically, if you're doing it under a residential deal, you might be trying to do it as a residential investment loan. And one of the things that people tend to do is they say, well, there's a house on it and this is the rent it's going to generate. And then the very next day after they've had the loan approved, they then go and demolish the home. Banks tend to not like that. If you've said that you're going to get rent and then the very next day you knock the house down, equally, banks don't like the fact that the security that you had on the property that you've just removed as well. So you need to have full disclosure to the banks up front in that process. And then assuming that you've got that full disclosure up front that you're going to go through the subdivision process, I'm going to say the last step before actually getting title is you need to go to the bank and say, well, right now you have a mortgage against one title, and I need to remove that mortgage and put a mortgage instead against the two titles that you're actually going to be creating. So it's actually called general consent. So you need the mortgage provider to provide that general consent in order to get that across the line. So they need to sign that piece of paper off. And if you've not informed them early in the process that that was your intended strategy, then they can, and they're within their rights to refuse that subdivision process. And if they don't sign it, then the only way around it is for you to pay out the mortgage in order to get that subdivision, I guess, title created. So hopefully that answers that, Shelley. So always be upfront with your loan funder right from the beginning. Have I missed any questions in there? Need to parch my breath. One of the things I've noticed is that when you talk so much, you don't get to drink. See how full that still is? No question. Ashish, reverse of that scenario if you have two titles on one house. Well, it's not a reverse, mate. If you've already got the two titles, then you've already got the mortgage against it. It really depends on if it's two lots or two titles. And I think there's a subtle difference there in terminology. So if it's two titles, then there's nothing to do. If it's two lots on one title, then the bank will still need to approve it because you are still separating the title. So quite a little subtlety, but that can catch people out. So Shelley says thanks. Any other questions from the crowd, folks? I'll just take a sip while I'm waiting for those to come in. Can't see any coming through. I'll just scroll back and see if I can find something in there. I can see Jim and Daniel have joined. It was a little while ago, but hi, folks. Steve's asking a million questions. I think I've answered most of those, Steve. Well, I can't see any questions sitting there, folks, so this is your time. Thank you, Steve. Great information. I appreciate that. No questions. Well, if there's no questions, I can call that a wrap. I'm going to give that 30 seconds or so until somebody asks me something. I can normally prattle on for hours, guys. Oh, Ashish, how was my Sydney meeting yesterday? Thanks for asking, mate. I appreciate that. So, yes, I didn't cover that at the start of the preso. So, yes, we had our monthly session in Sydney yesterday. So, for all the Sydney siders who are watching, we are on the 4th Saturday of every month down there. I will put a link into this chat so people can actually join our meetup group there. We are actually changing venues next month. So we're moving away from the Bankstown Sports Club to something a little bit more central at the Rides Eastwood Leagues Club. Now, it is the 4th Saturday of every month normally, but next month is the one exception, and that's because there's an election down in Sydney on the 4th Saturday. So we're going to try and bypass the election process. So let me just type in... So I'm just going to give you a generic link here, and if anyone jumps on that link there, it will actually give you all the links to all the different meetup groups. So there'll be a Brisbane one, a Sydney one, and the Melbourne one that's coming up. They're all off the one page. That saves me typing in a bucket load onto the one screen. Clayton says, I have an opportunity to buy 4,300 square metres for 700k with the potential to subdivide into 9 lots, renovate the house and sell. Would you renovate and sell first, then subdivide? So the answer, Clayton, is chances are you can't sell until you've subdivided, because if you want the house on its own title, you can't physically get the cash until such time as it's on its own title. So it's a chicken and egg scenario there. You need to be doing the two in parallel. You can sell it off the plan, so with an off-the-plan contract saying this is what we propose the lots to be, but you can't physically receive the cash until the title actually exists. So hopefully that answers that. What that will do, though, is allow you to reduce your risk by letting the bank know that that's actually sitting there as a guaranteed sale. So that's one of the things that I would do. What type of property is best held in an SMSF? I'm going to say, Tim, that I'm not a self-managed super fund expert. What I would say, though, is anything that is positively geared is going to be good for your self-managed super fund. You want something that's low touch and going to be just keeping on giving forever and a day. So passive income is what I would put in self-managed super fund. You can certainly go for long-term capital growth if you have no requirement to sell, if you believe that you can, I guess, service any negative cash flow in that timeline, but I'd be going for positively geared every way. That's me personally. That is not tax advice, let me assure you. But me personally, I never, ever, ever, ever want to do negative gearing ever again. 20 years of that was plenty for me. So question from Steve, indirectly from Cecilia, my wife. Are you able to get funding with the interest being capitalised payable at the end of the development? So the answer is yes, you can, Steve. So that's going to be commercial lending in order to do that. Commercial lending will generally have a much higher equity stake. So depending upon the risk of the deal, they might want a minimum of 30% equity in the deal, and they could want anywhere up to 40, 45% equity in the deal in order to do that. When they do that, serviceability of your income stream tends to not be considered anymore, and instead they look at the deal in and of its own right and whether or not the deal is going to be profitable. So assuming that's the case, they're happy to capitalise that. So the interest gets tacked on to the end of the deal. So it still gets accumulated, but you don't have to service it along the way. So that's called capitalised interest. And generally you'll find that those sorts of deals, the banks that are, or the lenders that are trying to do that will generally have a limited timeline that they're willing to actually wear that risk for. So depending upon the size of the deal, it might be between 1 and 3 years' time typical. And the individual lenders may want some pre-sales to minimise that risk. So Clayton says, great, thanks. No loan, I'm a cash buyer. Well, good for you, Clayton. I'm going to give that a like. So anytime you're a cash buyer, that makes things very, very easy. Who would you recommend for the commercial loan for development subdivision? So what, Clayton, that really depends on, and I'm going to answer this. So whilst I know where you're based, there are, I guess, a number of people around Australia here. There are a number of different lending providers at different sizes. So depending upon the deal size would depend on the lender that you would go for. So there are, I guess, your typical big four banks. Then there's your second tier banks. Then there's, I guess, secondary lenders. Then there's mezzanine lenders. Then there's private lending. So as you go further down the food chain, the flexibility in their terms becomes a lot easier. So the big four banks will generally only lend you money when you've proven to them that you don't need it. And lower down the food chain, but when they do it at quite low interest rates. And lower down the food chain, they're happy to lend based on the credibility of the deal and credibility of you, but they generally are taking a lot more risk in that process, so they'll have the interest rate accordingly. So Shelley, when buying property in a trust with a corporate trustee, how is serviceability calculated? Is it the director or, of the company whose income serviceability is evaluated? And if so, is it better to have two directors so there is more serviceability? So again, technical question, and I'm not an accountant, so I'm going to asterisk it with that. But yes, the bank will always want the directors and directors' guarantees in looking at the loan, especially when the company has not traded before. There's no actual history. They'll be looking at the directors and their ability to actually repay the loan. That comes down to whether or not it's a residential loan where serviceability is required or a commercial loan where they're looking at the deal itself, Shelley. So hopefully that makes sense. So Steve, good to say. Hi, Tony, how are you? Yes, I knew that you were in Queensland, Clayton. Thank you. So for you personally, it comes down to the size of the deal you're going for. I might deal with that offline, Clayton, to recommend you to individuals locally, because anyone that I recommend to you might be different for the next person based on the different kind of the deal. So can see Jason and Louisa, how are you? Late to the party, folks, but we're coming to the end of the show. So what is a director's guarantee? Shelley. A director's guarantee is, I guess, the whole point of an entity, whether it be a company or whether it be a trust, and apologies for the shaking camera, folks. See if I can hold it. The wind is blowing quite severely here, as you can see. Any entity is really set up there for asset protection purposes, and especially when you're creating a brand new entity for any particular deal, the bank is going to say, well, that entity hasn't traded, hasn't got any assets, so the directors who are actually controlling that entity need to be the one who provide, I guess, the guarantee that if the entity collapses in any way, shape or form, that the director can actually honour the loan even when the entity is gone. So that is what a director's guarantee is, and they effectively, it means that they can look outside of the entity in order to do that. Because of that, it's actually quite important that any directors that are doing anything at all have got asset protection across all of their assets across the board. So try and minimise anything that you've got in your own personal name. Ray, how are you? What would that liability restrict directors to borrow? So anytime you put your name against any loan, Ray, that impacts your ability to take on another loan. So you need to disclose any loans that you're in to every single lender as you go. So loan number one, you'd only be disclosing that particular loan. When loan number two, you'd need to disclose the previous loan. So yes, as you add more and more loans to the portfolio, even if they are in different entities, you still need to disclose that to the next bank along the way. Siobhan, hi Rob, how are you? Hi Linda, how are you? Hi, better late than never. Yes, Linda, better late than never. Okay, and other than that, no more questions at the moment. So we're 32 minutes in, folks, and I'm only 2 sips into my beer. Make that 3. Any other questions? Boy, it is windy out here. Hopefully that that wind is not coming through on the microphone. If somebody could give me a yay or nay if that wind's coming through on the microphone, that would be awesome. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. Okay, well, I can't see any more questions coming through. So we're going to be doing this every single Sunday. So I'm happy for it to be anywhere between 30 minutes and 45 minutes or so, depending upon the number of questions that come through. What I would really like to do is have an individual theme every single week. So if you've got a specific question that you would like answered or a particular theme, I will start the session talking on something about that theme, and then we can take questions around that, I guess, during the process. I can see a late question here from Brendan. What to use to determine the best usage of a block? Best usage, interesting term there, Brendan. So there's a thing called highest and best use, which is not necessarily maximum yield. So, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more clarity. So hypothetically, you might have a block of land that has the potential for a three-story unit complex, but when you go and cost out the project and put the three-story unit complex on there, the cost to construct might be too high and the resales might be very low. So the profitability in that deal might be quite low. But if you alternatively put less townhouses on there, you may find that the cost to construct is lower, the resale price is higher, and the profitability of the deal might be a little bit higher in that instance. So highest and best use, as opposed to maximum density, is going to determine what the best usage for the block is. And that is going to be very subjective to the individual block, the individual location, and the supply and demand of anything in and around that area at that particular time. Noting that markets change, supply and demand does change. So highest and best use now and highest and best use in 6 months' time or 12 months' time may actually be a different outcome as things like your building costs change and as the market actually changes as well. So hopefully that answers that, Brendan. So Siobhan, best place website to get high-level construction costs. So I'm going to say any quantity surveyor will have those costs for you, Siobhan. I tend to use one called BMT Quantity Surveyors. They have a construction cost table that they publish and update quite regularly. Now that, I will say, they base that on seeing hundreds of jobs come through, and they average the cost of construct across all of those jobs, and they'll be able to tell you across quite a large range as to what a project home's going to be, what an architectural home's going to be, what a two-story home is, what a three-story home is, units, townhouses, all that sort of thing. Now, I would say that they are quite conservative with their numbers. So you can generally get a better construction price than what they promote. So when you're doing your feasibilities, it may make your feasibilities look a little bit on the low side, but at the same time, I'd rather underestimate that than go the other way around. So Vanessa, only the building one. Okay, so might do that as a separate session if that's okay, Vanessa. Any particular program spreadsheet, Brendan? Sorry, mate, I'm not quite sure the reference there. So if you want to give me a little bit more info on that, I'll try and come back to that. So a building theme, single home, would it be appropriate as a theme? Actually, that's a good theme, Vanessa. So I'll come to that. Whether that's next week or the week after, that's a good theme. Options and how they function would be a good theme. Definitely, Jason. Happy to do that as a theme. That's a very good idea. Hi, Michael. A bit late to the party, mate, but glad you turned up. Buy flip, demo flip at the moment. I would like to know if you can experience doing this project using a project builder. So the question that you've just fleshed out there, Vanessa, what I'll do is I'll roll that into the building theme, and I'm happy to make that next week. So we can talk about building themes next week. Have you ever had block with Brisbane City Council owning strip of the footpath preventing a driveway? Any advice on overcoming? So I've not had it with Brisbane City Council, but I have had it with Logan City Council, Linda. And yeah, basically you need to apply for that to, it's called an access restriction strip, and generally they put it there because they genuinely want to have the access restriction. And for everyone else who've never come across this, when you're looking at your title, you generally see a very large parcel of land, and an access restriction strip is quite often a small sliver, maybe a centimetre wide, maybe 10 centimetres wide, which is actually another lot that council actually own, and because they own it, they can prevent you actually crossing it. So that's called an access restriction strip. So the process I had to go through is actually lodge the application, raise that as a formal request as part of a condition of the process, and be able to justify through a traffic engineer that there was no impact to or danger to the neighbouring surrounding area with the traffic coming on and off going over that easement. Now, depending upon why they put that access restriction strip is one thing, and quite often they'll do that when it's beside a main road. So you may need to get the Main Roads Authority to actually approve that. Hopefully that answers that, Linda. Thank you, Siobhan. I appreciate that. Brendan, I'm a residential real estate agent. That's both good and bad, Brendan. I'm not going to judge, mate. I find blocks of land and have my own way of determining what a developer might build on there. Just seeing what else might be out there to help me guide what is the best use of the land. So the easy answer to that, Brendan, is start with the end in mind. So what is the finished product going to sell for? What is the I guess, the market demographic looking for that particular product. And quite often, as a developer, when I'm exiting a block of land, I'll have a look at whether or not it makes better sense for me to exit it as vacant land or better sense for me to sell it as a finished product. And if it was going to be a finished product, what would it be a project home? Would it be an architectural home? What would the level of finishes be? That sort of thing. And that's basically what the demographics of the area are asking for and what the market is actually asking for. So look at what the market wants, look at what that's going to sell for, and then work backwards, Brendan, is what I would say to that one. I've got a perfect example of a project that I did in Kenmore where I managed to sell a project, but between the day I purchased it and the day I exited it was 193,000 profit in 3 months as vacant land. And if I had have taken that through to construct, it would have taken me another 6 to 9 months and I would have made exactly the same amount of money. And that's because that particular market demographic wanted the ability to actually build their own home rather than taking over a home that had already been pre-constructed. If I went 2 suburbs over, then the exact opposite was true. If I had built something brand new, then that would have got the premium and the land would have not got much at all and potentially even made a loss. So every single suburb has its own drivers in that regard, mate. So have a look at that. It's not a one size fits all, but if you know your area, and as an agent, I'm sure that you're an expert in your little area, you'll be knowing exactly what your demographics and your clients are looking for. So hopefully that helps there, mate. So Shelley, if there's a tree on the front of council strip hitting power lines, when you develop, does this become developer's issue cost? No, if it's on the council's nature strip, it's actually a council issue. So you, I guess, could and should at any point in time be, I guess, lodging that with council to come and trim. That's just a pure safety issue, and they'll generally come out. Generally takes them 20 odd days to come out and actually assess the issue. And then from there, it might be another 20 days before they resolve the issue. Now, if you're wanting the tree removed, then that needs to be, I guess, an application through to council whenever it's on council land in order to do that. They have no obligation to do that if you're doing a subdivision, although generally, if it's within their rules to subdivide there, they're generally quite amenable to the tree being removed. The tree then gets removed at your cost, and you generally have a secondary cost where they plant another tree somewhere else in the community in order to replace the one that got lost. Clayton, that sounds good, Rob. As I have an opportunity to buy a burnt down house where the owner wants to sell the land, would have to clear the site and have a builder build on it. Any advice next week would be great. Next week is going to be very challenging to get hold of me, Clayton. I'm actually doing a kickoff event, a 3-day event, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, which is part of our property development formula program. So doing a lot of prep work in order for that to happen. So getting manuals printed and finalising all of that. So next week is a little bit challenging for me. Happy to try and see where I can point you in the right direction, but I probably can't spend a lot of time actually looking at a deal. I apologise in advance on that one. Linda, should I go PTE lodgement? Are you talking private lodgement? I'm not quite sure what the acronym is standing for there, Linda. I apologise. Luke, thank you. Appreciate that, mate. Brendan, in line with my current knowledge. Good man. Thank you. Appreciate that. Wasn't having a go at the dig being an agent. I'm an agent myself, so I just don't publicly advertise that. I tend to use mine for deal finding services. So as we find a deal, I can actually flick that on. I'm certainly not a salesman. So kudos to you, mate. I know it's hard work, and I commend you for the effort that takes to actually do that. So okay, I can't see any other questions coming through, and that's 45 minutes. So I might call that a wrap. I've got a couple of ideas that came out of the session for, I guess, next week and potentially the week after. So Vanessa has suggested one on different forms of building and how you would actually go about that process. And I can't remember who, but somebody asked about options. So might do those over the next coming weeks. If you've got any questions in and around those particular topics, Happy for them to be sent through prior so I can do a little bit of prep. And I guess can start the first 10 minutes, I guess, trying to deal with those specific issues. Or alternatively, you can just give them to me on the fly as we have today. So hopefully, folks, that's you got a bit of value out of that one, and appreciate everybody coming online. And I guess look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye for now.